A pilot and his new bride had just gotten married. 4 days after the honeymoon was over, they hopped on their plane to fly home. Unfortunately, something went terribly wrong when he made a tragic mistake and they crashed just 8 minutes after taking off. There's a lot we can learn from what happened on this short flight. My name is Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Lindsay Vogelaar was the bride. She was born in 1987 and graduated from Grand Valley State University with a master's degree in international education. She loved to travel, and in 2015 she took a job as a flight attendant with United Airlines. Costas Civilis was the groom, and he was the pilot. He was born in 1990 and attended his dream school, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona, Florida, where he served as a flight instructor. He graduated in 2012 and began a career in aviation. He was a captain at PSA Airlines before he was hired in 2015 by United Airlines, where he was a first officer on the Boeing 757-767. Lindsay and Costas initially met each other while they were on a layover in the United Kingdom, and they would eventually fall in love. They loved going on adventures, and they knew they were meant to be together. That's why they decided to get married, and on September 28, 2020, they eloped and they left their home in Florida to fly out to Telluride, Colorado for their wedding. The aircraft they were flying was a 1964 Beechcraft S35 Bonanza that Costas had recently purchased, and they nicknamed Baby Blue. The couple took photos throughout the trip to share their adventure with family and friends. It took them 2 days to make the trip to Colorado, and everything seemed to be going perfectly. Costas had 5,750 hours of total flight time, but only about 130 of those hours were in Baby Blue. Now, despite his somewhat limited experience in the Bonanza, Costas was well regarded as an excellent pilot, and he was a huge ambassador for the aviation industry with his efforts promoting the airline pilot career to today's youth. That's why, to better understand the tragic mistake on this flight, we need to start by taking a closer look at where they were flying. The most important thing you need to know about Telluride is that the airport is over 9,000 feet above sea level, making it the highest elevation airport in the United States. The runway is 7,111 feet long, and it's located in a very mountainous area, and that's why the airport remarks recommend that pilots take off using runway 27, because that's going to the west, and the slope of the terrain is going to be more favorable in that direction. If you take off from runway 09 going to the east, then you have nothing but 13,000-foot mountains in front of you and a very short distance to climb above them. One of the other challenging aspects of this airport is that it sits on a mesa, and there's even a warning about how there can be strong vertical turbulence near the edge of the mesa. However, probably the biggest issue that pilots need to consider when they're flying around Telluride, or really anytime they're flying around the mountains or at a high elevation airport, is density altitude. Now, I've mentioned this in several other videos on my channel, but the easiest way to think of density altitude is that it's the altitude that your aircraft feels like it's at. Costas did 2 flights out of Telluride on the day that he crashed. We're going to take a look at that first flight in a minute, but for now, we know from the investigation that when he took off, even though the field elevation was 9,078 feet, his aircraft was going to perform like it was taking off at 10,858 feet. The problem with density altitude is that the higher it is, the worse your aircraft is going to perform. That's because at higher altitude, the air is less dense, and a normally aspirated engine will lose about 3.5% of its horsepower for every 1,000-foot increase in density altitude. That means even though Baby Blue might produce about 285 horsepower on a good day down at sea level in Florida, where Costas was doing most of his flying, she's only going to have about 175 horsepower when he took off from Telluride, and that's a pretty big difference that you have to take into consideration when you go flying. The other problem is that as the air gets thinner, your true airspeed increases about 2% for every 1,000 feet of altitude, which means your ground speed is also going to increase. Now, when you combine all these factors, you get less engine power, longer takeoff rolls, longer landing distances, and a pretty significant reduction in your aircraft climb capability. And that brings us to the first flight that Costas did on the day of the crash. On the morning of October 5th, 2020, just 4 days after they got married, Costas and Lindsay decided to take 2 photographers up on a sightseeing flight around the Telluride area. The ADS-B data from the flight showed that Costas departed from runway 27 and then made a turn to the left back towards the town. He initially offset to the right to avoid overflying the town, and then he headed up towards the canyon, and my guess is they were trying to get a closer look at Bridal Veil Falls, which is located over here. One of the things you'll notice from the data is that as he made his approach, he was offsetting to the north and hugging the higher terrain to leave himself enough room to turn back to the right. And I actually thought this was a good decision because you never want to fly directly up the middle of a canyon, especially with rising terrain in front of you. Instead, you want to offset to the side to give yourself some more turning room in case something goes wrong and you need to turn around. The only thing I didn't like about this was that I thought he started turning around a little too close to where the canyon starts to narrow. If you look at this from a different perspective, you can see how steep the canyon walls are, and there's only about 3,000 to 4,000 feet between each side of the canyon to make that turn. I think the safer thing to do would have been to approach this from a much higher altitude above the mountains, and that way he wouldn't have to worry about it. The good news is the dashed line shows you that's exactly what Costas ended up doing. Later in the flight, during the recovery back to Telluride, he flew over the same area, but this time he was at about 14,000 feet, so he could easily clear the terrain. And if his engine failed or something else went wrong, he had plenty of room to glide down towards the town. After they landed, Costas and Lindsay refueled, and then they got ready for the next flight to begin their journey home. This is the ADS-B data from the second flight, and initially it looks very similar to the first. They took off from runway 27 and turned back to the east. The only difference is this time Costas offset to the left, flying to the north of the town. This is the cockpit view, and I think it gives you a better perspective of what Costas was looking at as he flew past the town headed to the east. And I think it also gives you a real sense of how high these mountains are. And as we watch what happened during the flight, the first thing that you need to pay attention to is the airspeed on the left-hand side. Now keep in mind that this is ground speed, and we don't know what the exact winds were at his altitude on the day of the crash, but based on some of the reports that I've seen, my guess is that his indicated airspeed is actually about 10 knots slower than what you're seeing on the screen right now. The reason this is important is because if you're trying to climb above the mountains, then you have two options. You can climb at VX speed, which is your best angle of climb, or VY speed, which is your best rate of climb. VY gives you the most altitude gained in the shortest amount of time, but the problem is you're going faster. So you're going to cover more distance over the ground when you're doing it. That's why whenever there's an obstacle that you need to clear, like some mountains out in front of you, then VX is what you want because it gives you the most altitude gained over the shortest distance. VX is a slower airspeed than VY, and it might take you longer to climb 3,000 feet, but that doesn't matter if it means that you can do it in a shorter distance and clear the mountain that's in front of you. VX for the Bonanza S35 is about 76 knots, so you can see that Costas is generally climbing out maybe just a little bit faster than that, give or take a few knots depending on the winds. Over on the right-hand side of the screen is his altitude, but I want you to pay attention to the smaller number to the right of that because that's his vertical speed, or how many feet per minute he's climbing or descending. This isn't going to be precise because the ADS-B data is going to lag a little bit here and there, but in general, he's only going to be able to average a few hundred feet per minute for most of the flight up the canyon. It might be hard to tell from the simulation, but one of the problems that I didn't talk about earlier is that when you're flying low in a canyon like this, rising terrain can be very deceiving. It's hard to look out in front of you and figure out how fast that terrain is rising or how much room you have to climb. That's why it's so important to always leave yourself a way out. If we look at this map, the elevation near the base of the falls is around 9,500 feet, and it's only about 2 miles to the ridgeline where the elevation is closer to 13,000 feet. That means based on his average ground speed of 90 knots, Baby Blue needs to climb about 3,000 feet per minute to clear the ridgeline, and that's something the aircraft is never going to achieve even if they were at sea level. I have to interrupt for a second because after I finished filming and editing the video, I discovered something pretty shocking about the tragedy that I need to talk about. However, I want to be clear that what I'm about to share with you was not in the NTSB report, and it wasn't in the docket with all the investigation supporting documents. You'll notice that one of the things missing from the docket is witness statements and interviews. Specifically, the NTSB did not interview the photographers that flew with Costas and Lindsay on the day of the crash. The reason I bring this up is because it's been reported that it was possible that the purpose of the first flight that day with the photographers was to scout locations for a photo shoot. And allegedly, the photographers were going to position themselves somewhere in that canyon to take a picture of the aircraft with a scenic background during the second flight. Now, I don't know if that's what really happened or not, and I'm even a little reluctant to share this with you because I couldn't independently verify the information. However, I thought it was important enough to talk about because if it is true, then the tragedy starts to make a little bit more sense because now we're talking about a scenario where Costas never intended to fly over the mountains, and instead he was just trying to fly a little further up the canyon so he could turn back around and fly past the falls for a photo shoot. Even though Costas was a great pilot and he was highly respected, the NTSB could not determine how much high-altitude mountain flying experience he had in single-engine airplanes. And my guess is it wasn't that much because he started his aviation career in Florida and he was living in Florida when he bought Baby Blue. Even though the altimeter shows that he was around 12,000 feet, the density altitude at the crash site was 13,747 feet. And I think it's possible that he was offsetting to the left because maybe that flight that he did earlier gave him a little bit of false confidence in his ability to turn around in the canyon. At some point he lowered the flaps, possibly to make the turn, but he just didn't have enough airspeed and he ended up stalling the aircraft. The two biggest lessons we can learn from this are that you have to understand how density altitude is going to affect your aircraft performance, and when you're flying in the mountains, you always have to leave yourself a way out. This was just an extremely sad and tragic story because Costas and Lindsay didn't survive the crash, and my heart goes out to their family and friends because they were two incredible people whose lives were cut way too short. And my only hope is that this debrief helps prevent someone else from making a similar mistake. And if you found the debrief helpful, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.